Okay, Aristotle was not primarily a philosopher. He was a natural scientist. And his main interests were in biology, and especially in classifications of things. And you can see in his philosophical method, too, that he's proceeding like a scientist would. He tries to develop a taxonomy of different lives and a classification system to understand different moral perspectives. Okay, so Aristotle is the great thinker that he is because he had this keen insight that the way to understand the world is by observation, by measurement, by description, by observation, by calculation. And that seems like such a no-brainer to us. It's hard for us to see the profundity of it at the time. It's kind of like reading Shakespeare and saying, man, this dude is just full of cliche phrases. Well, they weren't cliche phrases when Shakespeare wrote them. They became cliche phrases because Shakespeare became so influential. Okay, Aristotle's notion that you can look at the world around you, the empirical world, and by means of observation identify and discern truth is an idea that has been so incredibly influential throughout human history, it is almost impossible to overstate his massive, massive impact on the world. We're focusing in this class just on one of his texts, the Nicomachean Ethics. It's a set of lecture notes, so when you read it, it seems a little disjointed. It's because these are lecture notes taken by students encountering his talks, his discussions. Okay, so if you're like me when I was in college, I was a terrible note taker. Whoever took these notes was much better than I was. I would write things down from lectures, and I'd go back a couple weeks later and look at what I wrote down, and I'd have no idea what was going on. I was like, what the heck was I smoking? Like, I have no idea. I can't even read my own handwriting. There's that problem too. Okay. Aristotle in this text is trying to offer us practical assistance about how to live a successful human life. Okay, this is a kind of a self-help manual. Think of it as an ancient self-help manual. And he says here at the beginning of book 1, I'm reading the Ostwald translation. Does the bookstore, Riley, I see yours, is that the Ross that the bookstore is offering? Okay, but that is the bookstore version, I think. Okay, at any rate, follow along as best you guys can in whatever translation you're looking at. Okay, Aristotle, in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, is attempting to identify what it is that human beings are aiming at. Okay, what it is that is the purpose of human life. What do human beings aim at, and what ought they to aim at? And the idea here is that if we can understand precisely what the purpose is of human life, then we can also understand how we can be good at human life, because we can understand what it is that we need to do in order to accomplish that purpose. Okay, so it's a really big picture kind of a goal that he set for himself. But he says here, look, the good is that at which all things aim. Every activity, every applied science, every systematic action or investigation aims at some good. And he says, if you think about the different kinds of professions, they each have an end or a good. For instance, medicine, the end is health. Shipbuilding, the end is producing a vessel. In wartime strategy, the end is victory. And in household management, the end is wealth. So he reasons, what is it that is the end of human beings? What is the goal or the purpose or the end? The Greek here is a famous word called telos. And for Aristotle, this investigation in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics is a telos investigation, a teleological investigation. He's trying to identify what the goal is that we ought to be aiming at in human life. Okay, and he goes on to talk a little bit about how different people appear to aim at different things, but he thinks he can identify what it is that all people aim at in all lives. It might be useful for us just to identify it ourselves intuitively. Okay, so why are you guys taking this class right now? Let's start there. To graduate is a required class, isn't it? Okay, let's take a step back and ask the further question. Why do you want to graduate? Why do you want a college degree? So you can obtain work, better paying job, more opportunities professionally, some educational insights. Yeah, Kendrick?
Well, for many, usually it's to have a life of fulfillment, to have a career where you can help others, or a passion.
Okay. Okay, good. Why do you want a well-paying job? Why do you want a career where you can help others or do something meaningful? What's the aim of that? Better your socioeconomic status. Okay, maybe you get a house in the burbs, marry, get to go on vacations, have kids. You could have 4 kids like me. Yes?
We're given life. What better way to use it than to work towards a goal that allows you to do good in this world?
Okay.
Regardless of what your profession is.
Okay, good. All right. Ultimately, Aristotle says the end goal that explains all of these intermediate goals is happiness. Ultimately, what we all seek is happiness. The reason why you want a better paying job, or you want a job that provides meaningful work opportunities, chances to impact others, make the world a better place, is happiness. Okay, happiness, or the Greek word here is eudaimonia, is the goal that all human beings seek. Just like individual professions are aimed at particular goals, riding a horse is, horsemanship is aimed at successful steering of your horse. Shipbuilding is aimed at a vessel. Strategy is aimed at victory, etc. So also human beings aim at happiness. That is the goal of human life, Aristotle says. We all want happiness. Now, the thing is, some of us, well, all of us want happiness, but we pursue happiness in different ways. Okay, and he talks about this in the course of the first book here. Some of us pursue happiness in ways that are more successful than others. The klepto who goes into Nordstrom's in the Galleria to steal clothing wants happiness just as much as you trying to work hard to finish your degree at HBU. He wants happiness because he thinks that when he steals clothing, he will better accomplish, or he will improve his life somehow. It will go better for him. Now, he's just mixed up about what exactly will bring about success and happiness. But he is desiring happiness. All of us desire happiness. Okay, now Aristotle canvasses several lives that he says are inferior as ways of pursuing happiness. So he says there's no dispute, if you look out at human beings and their behaviors, there's no dispute that we all want happiness. What is in dispute is what will enable us to attain happiness. Some people think it's one thing and others think it'll be another thing. I'm reading here in chapter 4 of book 1, if you want to follow along. Chapter 4 of book 1. Aristotle here writes, people would agree, for both the common run of people and cultivated men, say that we aim at happiness, and they understand by happiness the same as living well and doing well. But when it comes to defining happiness, to saying what happiness is, they disagree. And the account given by the common run of people differs from that of philosophers. Again, he goes on in the course of this chapter and the next chapter in Book 1, chapters 4 and 5, to talk about what some inferior lives are, or inferior ways of pursuing happiness. He says there's disagreement about how happiness can be achieved, and some of the ways that people seek happiness end up actually being honestly pretty bad as lives or pursuits of happiness. Let's look at what they are very briefly. Okay, if you have your text, please follow along with me. I'm reading in chapter 5 of Book 1. Okay, he says, the common run of people and the most vulgar identify happiness with pleasure, that is, physical pleasure. And for that reason, they are satisfied with a life of enjoyment. Okay, the common run of people betray their utter slavishness in their preference for a life suitable to cattle. Cultivated and active men, on the other hand, believe the good to be honor, for honor, one might say, is the end of political life. We'll talk about that momentarily. One inferior life, he says, then, is physical pleasure. We've all known people who build their lives around the pursuit of physical pleasure. That's how they think that happiness will be achieved. Okay, maybe your thing is, what's one of my weaknesses? Blueberry muffins at Java City. They're so good. Okay, maybe your thing is Oreo cookies. Maybe your thing is some other form of physical pleasure. Maybe it's sleeping in. Maybe your thing is rest on the weekends. Maybe your thing is some other form of physical pleasure. Maybe it's sexual encounters, hookups, the next fix, okay, drugs or something. Okay, we've all known people who think that they will obtain happiness through physical pleasure. Aristotle says physical pleasure is inferior, and the reasoning that he gives elsewhere, not just here in the Nicomachean Ethics in chapter 5, the reasoning he gives is that physical pleasure is never satisfied. So it's an inferior form of pursuing happiness. It's like a leaky cup. If you fill a cup with a hole in it, fill it up with water, it will leak out again. And you can eat those Oreos, and they taste great in the moment, but then the moment passes. And you need to do it again and again and again in order to get the same hit. Okay, we could imagine harder drugs than Oreos. Right? Or sleep or whatever. And so physical pleasure is inferior because it's something that you can't actually, it's not lasting, it's not permanent. It's something that always has to be redone, sometimes in harder and harder hits, in order to get the same kick. Okay, so he also talks about other forms of, other inferior ways of pursuing happiness. Okay, another that he lists here is the life of honor, or the political life. He says, cultivated and active men, on the other hand, believe the good to be honor. For honor, one might say, is the end of the political life. He says this is inferior. The life of political engagement, or we might also say the life of public approval, the life that is lived for the approval of others. Why does he think this is inferior? Well, he goes on to talk about this in the course of chapter 5. He says, a life lived for the sake of public approval is inferior because you are placing your happiness in the hands of others. If you require others to approve of you in order for you to be happy, then if they refuse to offer that approval, then you won't be happy. And presumably, happiness should be something that we should be able to have within our own grasp, and it shouldn't be dependent upon others' opinions. Okay, I was, some time ago, I guess I was reading an essay about Madonna, who we all know. At least I think we do. This has been some time now since my youth. Madonna.
I don't think she's as prominent as she used to be.
Okay, yeah, I'm probably showing my age by referencing her. She was actually like one of the original 80s pop stars who, she had an enduring career into the 90s and the aughts. I know she's like passed on now from like youthful, pop star stardom. But she paved the way for all the contemporary people. Anyway, she said that the only time she was ever truly happy was when she was in front of an audience and people were showering praise upon her. Okay, this is like a quote from the article. And I thought to myself, wow, that must be awful, because you can't have that in perpetuity, and eventually the crowds leave. So I assume she gets deeply unhappy when that's not available to her. Anyway, it just struck me as being kind of a sad state to be in.
I think right now the closest thing to that we can actually, that's pertaining to our generation is what people call influencers. Right?
The influencers, yeah. YouTube stardom, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where like they demand absolutely I have like so and so many, and like if they don't have that following, they're absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and you can see that they just get a kick out of seeing how many likes they got on their posts, or how many followers have checked the box on YouTube or whatever the influencer platform is. Yeah, yeah. The life of honor or influence or politics, Aristotle says, is inferior because it requires you to rely upon others. And he wants to find something, he wants to identify something in life that we can do whether or not others are willing to help us achieve that. Okay, he canvasses one last view, the life of money making. Now, Aristotle is actually a little ambiguous on this, because he thinks that having money is actually a very important part of being happy. Okay, I know that like that'll rock some people's sensibilities, but he actually thinks that having money is an important part of being happy. But the life of money making is inferior if it is money pursued for its own sake. Money is only valuable, Aristotle says, if it is used for something else. That is, it is only valuable as a means. No one actually gains substantial, significant long-term happiness from money just in and of its own sake, okay, for itself. Money can buy us many things in life. It can buy us time with friends and family. It can buy us an education. It can buy us vacations. It can buy us nice things like properties, houses, various different material comforts. Kendrick?
But unfortunately, we can't take those things with us once we're done.
True. You cannot take it with you when you die. And in all those cases, it is only valuable insofar as we use it for something else. So money for its own sake is not something that Aristotle says is the superior life lived in pursuit of happiness. Okay, are there questions or comments about these inferior lives? Yeah.
Oh, why was this one considered inferior?
Because money is always only a means to something else. Yeah, money is never valuable in its own sake, for its own sake. Good. Okay, I'm turning the page now to the most famous part of Book 1, and that is Chapter 7. Okay, and here Aristotle outlines an argument that has gone down in history really as one of the most famous arguments in philosophy. Okay, I'm going to have to keep a tight board this semester since I got to stay in front of the video. So forgive me for frequently erasing please try to stay up on the note taking, but I'm going to have to be erasing frequently and just keep the board right here in front of the video. Okay, in chapter 7 of book 1, Aristotle offers us the function argument. Okay, and I'm going to read it and then I'm going to explain it. Okay, so bear with me because I want you to encounter the primary text. So I am going to read it, but then I'm going to talk it and explain what he says in the passage. He says here in chapter 7 of book 1, I'm looking at Stephanus number 1097b22, 1097b22. To call happiness the highest good is perhaps a little trite, and a clearer account of what it is still required. Perhaps this is best done by first ascertaining the proper function of man. For just as the goodness and performance of a flute player, a sculptor, or any kind of expert, and generally of anyone who fulfills some function or performs some action, are thought to reside in his proper function, so the goodness and performance of man would seem to reside in whatever is his proper function. Okay, should we not assume that just as the eye, the hand, the foot, and in general each part of the body clearly has its own proper function, so man too has some function over and above the functions of his parts? What can this function be? Is it simply living? He shares that function even with plants, but we are now looking for something peculiar to man. Accordingly, the life of nutrition and growth must be excluded. Next in line, there is a life of sense perception, but this too man has in common with the horse, the ox, and every animal. There remains then an active life of the rational element. Okay, and then further on in the next paragraph, the proper function of man then consists in an activity of the soul in conformance with a rational principle. Okay, so what Aristotle is doing here in talking about the famous function argument is he's making the following set of claims. He's saying what we need to do in order to identify what it is that will truly, genuinely make people happy is we need to identify what kind of a thing human beings happen to be. Okay, you can see the biologist coming out here. You have to classify a human being. Define a human being, as it were, in order to identify what it is that will make a human being happy. Okay, and what is unique to us, Aristotle says, is presumably what is our defining characteristic. Okay, if we share the characteristic with other kinds of creatures, presumably it's not our defining characteristic. Once we find the defining characteristic, though, we can identify what it is that makes us us, and as such, what it is that is our purpose. Okay, what it is that makes us us is rationality. It's not simply living as such, since he says, plants have that. It's not consciousness as such. Animals have that, sense perception, right? That's shared. Rationality is humanity's distinguishing characteristic. And quite frankly, this is something that we have never encountered any other species with similar skills at. This is something that, sure, dolphins have extraordinary rationality, chimpanzees, etc., but not on the order of humans. You don't see dolphins having a discussion in a classroom about the good life and what will make happiness for them. Although you can actually apparently teach dolphins certain syntax. That's pretty extraordinary. You can, for instance, teach dolphins the difference. You can give them sentences like put the ball on the seal and put the seal on the ball, and they know which one is feasible and which one's not. They exhibit herding behavior. They can apparently commit rape and sexual assault. They cooperate in order to drive the fish in a certain direction. So they can do extraordinary things, right? But they can't do second order thought like we can do. We can step back and analyze our first order actions in a manner that no other species can do. We can know that we know something. That's a second order thought. We can engage in high-level conversation about complex topics. We have rational capacities that no other species has. So Aristotle says it stands to reason that we will find our greatest happiness then in the use of our minds and in the practice of our rational capacities, because that is our distinguishing characteristic. That is our distinguishing feature, and as such, it is that for which the practice of which will bring us the greatest amount of satisfaction and long-term happiness. Okay, I think what he means here is that a life of constant mental engagement, where you are always learning about your surroundings, always acquiring new ideas or new perspectives, always bettering your mind, your understanding of yourself and others. This is a life that is likely to be satisfied and happy. It's not necessarily an easy life. Study is hard. Book study is hard. Observational study of the world around us is often hard. It's often arduous. But it is a life of continual satisfaction, challenge, and engagement. Okay, and so the life of happiness for Aristotle is a life of rational engagements with the world. Okay, where we are acting in accordance with our kinds, namely, we are rational creatures. Rational animals is his famous definition, rational animals. We are acting in accordance with our kind, and by acting in accordance with our kind, namely rational animals, we will be happy. The greatest happiness then in life for Aristotle is a life that is lived in accordance with our rational capacities. That's the most famous part of Book 1 and maybe of the whole of the Nicomachean Ethics. But let me stop and ask if there are questions about it, because it's the kind of an argument that's kind of hard for post-Enlightenment people like us to wrap our minds around. It's an ancient argument. It's an argument that made sense in the context of an Aristotelian view of the world, namely a view of the world as having purposes. But it's sometimes hard for post-Enlightenment people to understand. Since the Enlightenment, it's been incredibly difficult to obtain consensus, especially in the Western world, about what the true worldview is. What is the good life for human beings? We live in America, and these days it's an incredibly pluralistic place, and you can live on a block where you have 5 different worldviews in 5 houses in a row. Okay, and these people's worldviews have almost nothing in common with each other. Things are really jumbled in the modern world. Things are really confused, and the modern world is a place where there has been great disagreement about the purpose of life and about what human beings ought to be aiming at in order to live good lives. The notion that you can use an observation of human beings and recognize that they have certain characteristics, namely rationality, and on that basis achieve some sort of a consensus about what the good life is for human beings and what human beings ought to be doing in order to obtain happiness is a very ancient idea. It's an idea that is much less accessible to post-Enlightenment people like us. So I want to pause and ask if there are questions or comments about this argument so that we can better understand. We're just getting started on Aristotle. We've got a lot to say here. It's a very rich text. Are there comments or questions about what precisely he means by the function argument?
I think it's a logical argument. I believe that he had a very, very correct analysis of what defines us as humans. You know? And as you stated, like no other animal, sits in a room and speaks. They might congregate together and they behave as such, as he defines it, that humans must behave as like a rational animal.
Sure.
Although you do see it in other herds, flocks, and stuff like that. I don't believe that there's any type of rationality rather than instinct.
Sure.
Chirping and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. It does. because I mean, I think that's a difference. We've tried it with gorillas. The closest things to humans, as scientists tend to claim.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they are able to communicate, and and it's extraordinary. Not every single ape, not every single monkey, not every single gorilla can communicate, but there are those exceptional things, and I think that is what kind of spurs this rational animal definition that Aristotle has put forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Aristotle's idea. So I agree with you, Bradley. I actually find this very intuitively plausible. The notion that you can look at a human being, and by identifying a human being's distinguishing characteristic, namely rationality, you can, on that basis, identify what the human being ought to be doing, what the purpose of the human being is, what will enable the human being to be satisfied. And Aristotle says, if we act in accordance with what our kind is, our capacities, our rational abilities, then presumably we will be satisfied as persons. I find that thought to be very intuitively graspable, and the sort of thing that I guess it syncs with personal experience. I have found times in life when my mind has been fully engaged. It's like flow, your mind is just sort of like deeply invested in some sort of task that's all encompassing. Some people experience this playing video games, right? They're just so like deeply involved, and it involves all their cognitive capacities to play the game. I experience this at times when I'm working math problems. It involves all my concentration, and I lose track of time, and I kind of lose consciousness of self. It's not like I'm aware of self in times like that. And when I'm really using my mind to its fullest extent, I often am very satisfied. And I find this to be an intuitively plausible argument on the basis of personal experience as well. Okay, good. Other comments or reflections before we move on? Yeah.
I believe there's also sort of unification between the two, between this whole idea of living in accordance with rational capacities, as well as having faith in God. In my life, I want to better myself. I want to improve myself and improve the life of others by becoming a nurse. But I also want to do so by following God and knowing what His plan is. But
Sure.
The thing is, I'm just a human. How am I supposed to comprehend God? So in fact, interacting with Him and just pondering about God, that in itself is actually engaging with rational capacity, because you're constantly asking, what does He want from me? What am I supposed to do? How do I know I'm doing the right thing?
Yeah. Good. Yeah, and actually what we're going to find as we go on in this semester and look at later thinkers, we're following a chronology of historical thinkers this semester. As we look on at thinkers who succeeded Aristotle, coming many hundreds or thousands of years later, it actually was an attempt on the part of Christian thinkers to synchronize Aristotelian conclusions about rationality as being the end of human beings with Christian theology, especially Christian insights into the nature of God, that brought about some of the most towering philosophical achievements that we're going to encounter this semester. So Thomas Aquinas, for instance, is very famous as a thinker in Christian history, and Thomas Aquinas' big contribution to philosophy was he took Aristotelian philosophical insights and he connected them up to Christian theological insights and developed a kind of a harmonious, synchronous worldview that was built on Aristotelian intuitive philosophical insights into human beings and Christian theological principles about the nature of God and spiritual affairs and spiritual issues, spiritual matters. Okay, so these ideas here have been very inspiring to many thinkers down through the centuries, and it's really a privilege for us to be able to encounter them directly. Let us go to the second book of the Nick Ethics, book 2, and we're going to talk about virtue. Now, Aristotle was keen to emphasize in book 1 that although the rational activity of the soul, your use of your mind to its fullest capacities is the central feature of happiness in life, still, it by itself is not enough. The reason why it's not enough is because there are other facets to human beings, other aspects of us. And there are certain things you need in addition to rationality in order to be truly happy. And one of the things that you need is virtue. Things you need to be a good person, a virtuous person, in order to be truly happy.
Are you familiar with Seneca?
I am, yeah.
Was he around the time?
He came after Aristotle and was very influenced by him. We do not have time in this class to read him.
Okay, I was just curious.
But his thought was very influenced by Aristotle, for sure.
Yeah, because we had to read that for one of my classes, and
Mhm.
I remember it was specifically on virtue, but I wasn't too entirely sure whether or not it was correlated with Aristotle's.
He was very influenced by Aristotelian thought, and many of his insights are kind of offshoots of Aristotelian thought. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so Aristotle thinks that you have to have virtue in order to be happy. If you are not a virtuous person, then you cannot truly be happy. It's a necessary and sufficient, or it's not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition for human happiness. There are two kinds of virtue for Aristotle. There is intellectual virtue and also moral virtue. Let me just put that up here. Let me define a virtue before we get into those two kinds of virtue, though. Intellectual and moral. A virtue is just an excellence or a skill. To play a musical instrument, it requires certain skills. Okay, so playing the piano requires dexterity of fingers. It requires the ability to read music quickly, the ability to interpret artistically the music that you're reading and to make the sounds, to coax the sounds from the keyboard in a way that is harmonious, that is musically pleasing. Okay, a variety of different skills are required by the practice of playing this instrument. We could imagine excellences or skills of a bunch of different social roles, not just musical instrument playing. Okay, in athletics, there are a large number of different skills that go into any particular athletic endeavor. Okay, virtue is a skill of human beingness. Okay, it's a skill of being a human being. Just as individual roles in life have certain virtues or excellences of them, so also virtue as such is a skill of the human, an excellence of human character. And to have a virtue, like the virtue of courage or the virtue of self-control, to be a courageous person or a self-controlled person, is simply to exhibit an excellence of human character. There are two kinds, intellectual and moral. We are primarily going to concentrate on moral in this class period, and in the next class period, we've only got about 5 or 7 minutes, so we're not going to get into this topic in any great depth. The intellectual virtues are virtues of cognition, virtues like practical reason or wisdom, the ability to think quickly with great discipline, with great concentration. Okay, and Aristotle does mention those, but we, for the sake of time, are going to focus primarily on the moral virtues. The moral virtues are the virtues of the human soul, and they are virtues that are acquired by means of practice. Okay, and this is an important point, and we're going to start here in our discussion of what a virtue is and how virtue is deployed. Okay, virtue comes about through practice. Central Aristotelian insight. What does that mean? Well, Aristotle says, whenever you look at any endeavor, the way people get better at that endeavor is by doing it, repeatedly doing it, until they eventually correct their mistakes, learn from their mistakes, and succeed at the endeavor. So also it is with virtue. The way you become a courageous person for Aristotle is practice by doing courageous deeds. You don't just wake up one day and become a courageous person by an act of your will. No, the way you become a courageous person, according to Aristotle, the way you develop a virtue like courage, is by repeatedly engaging in courageous actions, so that over time, a character state of courage develops in you and becomes manifested. Think of it in terms of a different virtue, self-control. You don't become self-controlled. Let's say you've struggled in the past with Oreo cookies, right? You don't become self-controlled with respect to Oreo cookies by an act of the will over a single instance. It's not just as though, one day by virtue of just saying, I will control my cookie habit, you come to control the habit. No. That's not the way it works. The way it works is through practice. You have to repeatedly deny yourself, the excessive helping of Oreo cookies. Keep it to 1 or 2. And you, over time, develop the character state of self-control with regard to Oreo cookies. Okay, or we could talk about this with regard to any one of a number of different virtues, patience, or generosity, or kindness. The way to think about Aristotelian virtue achieved through practice is in terms of a feedback relationship. And that relationship is between actions and character states. Okay, an action, if engaged in, creates a character state. Just a little bitty way. Okay? 1,000 actions done the same way create a much deeper character state. So action influences character. If you repeatedly deny yourself more than 1 or 2 Oreo cookies, like 24 times in a row or something like that, you will develop a character state of self-control. The action, having been engaged in multiple times, creates a corresponding mental stance. Now, it's a feedback relationship because the character state for Aristotle also shapes the action. So if you have a character state that is gluttonous, if that is something that you have indulged in a whole lot for a long period of time, then it will be pretty easy for you to fall into a gluttonous action in any particular situation. Okay, so if you are in the habit of just uncontrolled Oreo cookie eating, next time around, I can kind of tell you with a certain amount of probability, maybe high probability that, next time around, when you're by yourself with an Oreo package nearby, it's going to be pretty hard for you to control yourself. You'll probably have another binge. Okay, or I don't know, whatever the indulgence is. If you have a good character state, not a vice-filled, a vicious character state, if you have a virtuous character state, then that inclines you to do virtuous action. So action, if engaged in, shapes character, and character in turn inclines one towards certain actions. Okay, so if you are, for instance, if you have a character state of generosity, that will incline you to engage in generous actions. It will be easier for you to give freely and happily and willingly than if you have, a miserly character state, a greedy character state, where you just want to hoard material wealth for yourself. Like Ebenezer Scrooge, yeah. Right? It's real hard for him to do that. He has to be visited by the spirits. Like, it's got to, wrench him out of this vicious character state of greed that he's spent a lifetime building up. So if you have a virtuous character state that inclines you to virtuous action, an action that is virtuous, if engaged in, will create a virtuous character state. Okay, one last comment on this, and then I will throw it open for questions here at the end. Notice that the feedback relationship model of character formation for Aristotle doesn't just work for virtue, it works for vice as well. So it works the other way. If you are in the habit of viewing pornography on a repeated basis, online pornography or whatever, it will create a character state of uncontrolled sexual indulgence or excess that in turn will incline you towards certain actions. Okay, namely lust or some other similar sort of sexual excess. Okay, so it works for vice, just like for virtue. The feedback relationship can work either way. No single action does very much. Right? If you deny yourself your desire to sleep in this coming Saturday and say, no, I'm going to be virtuous, I'm going to get up and I'm going to exercise, it shapes your character in a little bitty way. No single action does a whole lot. But a successive pattern of actions can shape your character massively. Choosing sleep over exercise? Well, no individual instance of that choice will do that much to shape your character. But 24 instances will do a lot. 24 choices of exercise over sleep will also do a lot in the other direction. So virtue happens through practice, but the flip side of that is that vice happens through practice as well. Let me ask if there are questions or comments about Aristotle's. These are just preliminary ideas about virtue. He's got a bunch more things to say, a lot more things to say. Are there any questions or comments about this? Yeah, Kendrick.
It's more of a comment, but this idea of repeated instances causing the magnification and intensification of that thing reminds me of how, let's say, before I used to be overweight. I'm still a little bit overweight, but I realized I didn't become overweight overnight. That was a lifestyle of stagnation and sedentary lifestyle. But every single day I would start to walk and I started losing weight. It's not like one simple indulgence will mess you up. So I saw there was like a relation. It made sense.
Yeah, it's very intuitive to me as well. So if you think about some habits you want to change, the first thing you got to realize is if it's a deep habit, it's not going to change immediately. But it will change if incrementally small choices accumulate over time in a way that enables you to overcome the bad habit or whatever it is. Other comments or final reflections? Good. Great to have you guys today. Thank you for your attention. I will see you next week.